Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, I'll be starting a new series. It will be called Front Analysis, and what I'll be doing is I'll be analyzing each of these front lines from both perspectives, and we'll be starting out with the Zaporizhzhia front. So the way I'll be doing this analysis, it will focus on three things. The first one is terrain. What is the geographical terrain around the front line that I'll be analyzing? In this scenario, Zaporizhzhia front, there is this flatlands to the south, connected to the Black Sea. There's the Dnieper River, and there's these valleys and so on. But most of the land is flat and clear, with some rivers and seas to the south and the northwest. Now, what else is important? It's the weather. That's why I've decided on now to do these frontline analysis, because I don't expect any offensives in this coming week. And the reason for that is because if we look at the weather forecast, we see that from Saturday and onwards, there is positive degrees and a lot of rain, which will make the ground muddy. And we have just gone through a period with frozen ground, which is why we have seen a lot of fighting around Bakhmut as well as the Luhansk area. However, in this coming week, it will return to being muddy again, and after that, we will return to hard, tough ground that will not go muddy again. So from next week onwards is the time of frozen ground begins, and it will last until mid-February. So this indicates that from mid-December and onwards, this whole area will be frozen ground, which will allow major offensives in the area. So that's terrain out of the way. Next point is concentration of forces. And what I mean by this is that can one side, Ukraine or Russia, concentrate their forces in one area without the opponent either noticing or keeping up? So if Russia suddenly decides to pour 100,000 troops to the Zaporizhzhia front from all of these other areas that they have units, and manage to put 100,000 here while Ukraine only has 50,000 and cannot keep up or doesn't notice that this is happening. In that way, Russia will be able to conduct an offensive where they are outnumbering the Ukrainians 2-1. So with that knowledge, we can see that if one side has the ability to concentrate their forces in one front line without the opponent noticing or keeping up, then they have the advantage. And then the final point is logistics. And by this, I mean the supply lines. There are two types of supply lines that I'm focusing on in this war. The first one is the rail lines, which is clearly mapped out on this map. And then there's the second one, which is trucks. So from this perspective, we would see that if Russia cuts off the bridge between Zaporizhzhia and the west of Dnieper River, that way we will see that there will be no rail connection to Zaporizhzhia city. That means that they would need some trucks to go down from Dnieper city to Zaporizhzhia. Now, this would significantly slow down the supply lines of Zaporizhzhia, but on top of this, if the Russians then manage to also cut off this road here, then Zaporizhzhia will be completely cut off from supplies by cutting off the bridge and the road to the north. So these are the three things I'll be focusing on. So starting out with the front analysis on the Zaporizhzhia region. So starting out, we'll take a quick look at the terrain. We've already checked the weather, and we know that from next week onwards, the ground will be frozen all the way to mid-February, which is 2 months exactly. So starting out, we look at the terrain. Now, looking at the terrain, there are three important points from the Russian perspective. The first one is this valley here to the east, which is a small valley. However, it gives the Ukrainians a good position to fight from. If they have positions all over this valley, then they can attack any Russian advances across these highways that go to Zaporizhzhia from the Russian area, and they will have a good overview of the Russian supply lines. So, if Russia has any intention of taking Zaporizhzhia, they will have to get control over this valley and the eastern side of it. Now, the second thing to notice is these valleys here to the west go towards the river, These are all difficult to cross over, which means that the Russians will most likely not attack from the south towards the north. You'll have to go around from the east to avoid these valleys that they have to go through by the river. They'll also be exposed from the western side to Ukrainian artillery across the river, shooting down on their positions, as there's nothing between them and the Ukrainian position other than a river, and which will make it easy for the Ukrainians to spot Russian positions and shoot them down with their artillery from across the river. And that's the important geographical terrain in this front line from the Russian perspective. Now, moving on to concentration of forces. So far in this war, we have seen that the Ukrainians are able to concentrate their forces without the Russians noticing, which indicates that they are capable of doing that, as we've seen them do it in Kharkiv. However, in Kherson, it was clear that the Russians had a good overview over the Ukrainian forces and therefore managed to retreat as they saw the Ukrainians outnumbering them 5-1. This means that while there is an indication that the Ukrainians are capable, it is not clear exactly how capable. It isn't clear exactly how capable they are. But if we assume that neither side can concentrate their forces without keeping it a secret and always being noticed, then comes the questions: who will be fastest to relocate their forces to the Zaporizhzhia front? We know that it is somewhat equal right there. It is somewhat equal forces. This is somewhat equal concentration of forces by both sides on the Zaporizhzhia front right now. That is clear by the fact that neither side is taking the initiative to advance. It is also clear that they have built up these positions, defensive positions, since Russia captured this position and until now, which means about 6 months. So there's 6 months of built up defenses from both sides, and it is clear that both sides are about equal in their power here in the Zaporizhzhia front. So which side will be able to relocate their forces the quickest? If we look at the supply lines, we see that there are two major points. The first one is that Zaporizhzhia only has one rail line. The first one is that Ukraine only has one rail line connected to Zaporizhzhia, and if the Russians start shelling the bridge, just like the Ukrainians shelled the Antonovsky and Novakovka bridges, then they will have no rail lines connected to the city. While Russia has two rail lines, one from the eastern side and one from Crimea, that is connected to Zaporizhzhia, which means that the Russians are able to double up on the transport of equipment and troops to the front line, which means that Russia has the fastest capability to concentrate their forces in the Zaporizhzhia front. Now, the final point is logistics, which I mentioned earlier. There are two insignificant points for logistics for Zaporizhzhia for the Ukrainian side. The first one is the bridge. If the Russians start shelling the bridge, similar to Kherson and the Antonovsky bridge, we'll see that they will significantly lower the amount of supplies that comes to Zaporizhzhia. And then the second point is this highway to the north. That means that the Russians will most likely focus their forces on capturing this highway to the north. If we assume that it is 1 week from now and the ground has frozen and Russia starts an offensive, then their main points will be to attack from the east, from both the Orikhiv area and the Hulyapole area. If they manage to capture this and Orikhiv, they are able to move northwards from the east and go around the Zaporizhzhia city. With this, they will be moving westwards from the highway and northwestwards from the highway here, where they will be concentrating their forces on capturing these choke points in the highway and moving through these open fields towards the highway to cut it off from the north and the east. This is definitely going to be their focus, as if they manage to do this, they'll be able to cut off all supplies that goes to Zaporizhzhia. They'll have a wide front to work with. However, with the recent mobilization, they have enough manpower to do so if they concentrate their forces in this area. The second point to make is that if they manage to cut off supplies coming from the west, then the Ukrainian forces will not be able to quickly and easily resupply their forces, which means that if the Russians start a large air campaign, which they have prepared for, they'll be able to bomb the most significant areas as well as supply depots, which will put the Ukrainians in a poorly equipped with little to no ammo on the very first days of the offensive, which would leave them severely weakened and give Russia a large advantage. From the Russian perspective, they have the means and capabilities of taking Zaporizhzhia from the east and the northeast as soon as the weather freezes. So what about the Ukrainian perspective? The Ukrainian perspective, this will be completely dependent on whether or not they'll be focusing their air support and air defense systems here in the Zaporizhzhia region. If they do that, then they'll be able to counteract a Russian air campaign, as well as if they prepare proper defensive positions in these geographical areas like this valley here to the east and these valleys to the west, then they'll be able to hold these positions as they have been well fortified and they have enough equipment and soldiers in these areas. So this indicates that there are two important points for Ukraine. First one is to concentrate the air defense systems and their forces in this area. The second one is a very significant one, as we have seen them in the past couple of months train on doing naval invasions and crossing the Dnieper River. With this, they'll be able to outflank the Russian positions and land in Vasilivka. With this, they'll be able to cut off and do sabotage missions across the Russian front line and cut off most of their supplies, which will leave them weakened and allow the Ukrainians to counterattack and cut off their supply lines and forces. So if the Ukrainians want to properly defend Zaporizhzhia, they need to prepare already a few weeks ago, but they can still hurry up and send their forces to this front line, properly supported, and send the necessary air defense systems in this area. Other than that, the Russians have the advantage in both supplies and concentration of forces, which means that the Russians have the advantage on this front line. That's it for this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.